Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about a very intriguing aesthetic issue that I think deserves consideration and discussion. In my recent review of the John Elliott Gardner Omnibus 104-disc Monstro box, I mentioned the fact that his strengths were not as a normal conductor, a regular conductor of romantic music or post-classical music, but rather as an accompanist and as a choral conductor. And this is true, actually, of a great many participants in the HIP movement. They have been excellent choral conductors and excellent conductors of Baroque music with voices, of vocal music. And when I say that they're good as an accompanist, that really means that they remain choral conductors first and foremost. They're worried about the voice, and the instruments are kind of left to take care of themselves. But there's a wider issue, and that issue is this. Why is it that so many choral conductors are boring, dull as ditch water when faced with orchestral music, music without voices, music alone, without voices to tell you what the words mean, what the music is supposed to be expressing? This is a phenomenon that certainly predates the period instrument movement. It was one of the accusations that dogged, for example, the reputation of Robert Shaw, who was a superb choral conductor. But then when he got in front of the Atlanta Symphony, as often as not, playing regular orchestral music, he was just a snoozeroo. And so it is with many of these people. And I wanted to give some consideration to this issue because it really is a fascinating one. It's a very interesting question in musical aesthetics. And I think the first thing we need to acknowledge, and this was something that Donald Tovey pointed out in several of his essays, just one of these basic fundamental musical facts, which is this. All musical instruments are made to imitate the human voice. They either do vocal melody, or if they're percussion instruments, they do rhythm. But even that rhythm is based on the rhythm of the human body, essentially dance music. This is in tonal traditional music. So I'm not talking about avant-garde things that can be based on things like, quantum mechanics or, non-sexual reproduction of amoebae or things like that. I'm talking about regular music as we understand and listen to 99.9% of it. It's all vocal music. And that means something. We are, as organisms, we are hardwired to give prominence to vocal communication, and specifically vocal communication in the form of words. When we do not have words, something very interesting happens that Tovey pointed out. He was speaking about Debussy's Sirène, the last of his nocturnes, which he hadn't had a chance to play. And so he was not familiar, and he was curious about what the effect would be when you heard voices without actually singing words. Something very similar happens in the planets at the end, as you know. What happens when you hear voices used in a completely non-vocal way? The answer, of course, for Holst was you get space music. It sounds incredibly spooky, spiritual even, or mystical, because there are no words and it's coming from a distance. The same thing happens essentially in Debussy. But what is it that does it? What does it, as Tovey describes it, is the fact that the very second you hear voices, you hear a vocal timbre, you have the expectation that words will be sung, whether they are or not. And when that happens, no matter how elaborate or interesting the instrumental or orchestral accompaniment is, it immediately becomes background. It immediately becomes accompaniment. It may have the musical substance. It may actually be all of the music, may be in what we call the accompaniment, but we don't listen to it. You can hear in the same way, as soon as there's a voice. One of the most perfect test pieces for that is the Liebestod from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, because the vocal line is actually very declamatory and uninteresting. What Isolde is singing is perfectly written for what she needs to be saying. And when she actually does it on stage, as any of you who have seen it live will attest, as an orchestral performance, the Liebestod is overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. I mean, gouts of sound and the violins going, and it's panting and heaving and drooling and dripping and schwitzing, and it's just unbelievable. But when Isolde actually sings it, first of all, the conductor has to keep the orchestra down so you can hear her at all. But more to the point, you're so focused on what she's saying that you don't even notice what's going on in the background half the time. You just don't. It's an incredible phenomenon that you should think about a little bit. Try it out. Listen to the Liebestod with Isolde and without Isolde. It's a totally different experience because we are used to hearing words. Now, how does this affect conducting? Well, obviously, a conductor who has to conduct choral music, specifically, choral music with or without accompaniment doesn't matter. His concern is going to be clarity of diction, of getting the words across, of making sure that the choral sections are well blended, making sure that nothing sticks out unusually, that everyone is unanimous. Rhythm in choral conducting is an enormous problem because vocal rhythm is completely different from instrumental rhythm. I mean, each instrument has its own way of producing rhythm and accent in a musical line. Voices are completely in another universe because, first of all, actual percussive rhythm in choral singing is hard to achieve in a way which is musical. And second of all, every single kind of consonant has its own percussive accent attached to it. You don't pronounce the letter T the way you pronounce the letter F or the letter L or the letter R. These are all completely different, but they are all types of percussive accents because the rhythm in choral singing is carried on the consonants, whereas the melody, as it were, the sostenuto quality, is communicated in terms of vowel sounds. And each of those vowel sounds has a very, very different way of being expressed musically. I mean, that's why singing in French is such a pain in the ass for any of you people who have ever tried to sing in French, and why sung French is so different from spoken French, because French vowels are generally speaking swallowed. They're all mon frère, like this, right? But when you sing, it all has to be forward. It has to project out of your mouth. So it has to be mon frère. You have to be doing and you pronounce those last letters, frère, whereas you don't say that in spoken French. The whole concept of singing French is different because of the nature of language and the nature of the human voice as it applies to music. And that's what choral conductors, generally speaking, have to focus on. Now, instrumental conductors are completely different. It's a completely different circumstance. First of all, because instrumentalists know their instruments. They know how to project an expressive musical line in terms of their own instrumental technique. And it is not possible, simply not possible, for a choral conductor, any conductor, an instrumental conductor, to be in control of how each of his different instrumentalists is doing that at any given time, all at once. It's really an issue. That's why so many choral conductors are micromanagers and boring as a result, because they are trying too hard to stay in control of everything. And the result is an unpleasant rigidity, number one, and sameness, a sameness of articulation, a sameness of attack and accent, when the fact of the matter is, what you want in orchestral music is variety of attack and variety of accent, but also because of the use of words automatically reduces everything else to accompaniment. Automatically, without thinking about it, choral conductors become excellent orchestral accompanists, particularly in all vocal styles. And we're talking largely about music of the Baroque and classical periods, which is heavily vocal in style, number one, and which consists primarily of music for voices, rather than orchestral music, where the orchestra hadn't evolved its full complexity of expression until later in the 19th century. And so you have conductors like John Eliot Gardner or the Roger Norringtons or any of these people who when they dip their toes into later repertoire, they sound just awful. And I'm not saying that they're not aware of the problem, that they don't understand the differences. Maybe they do. But they can be extraordinarily talented in front of a choir and know everything there is to know about training a chorus, as Robert Shaw did, and still make a total mess of things when they're in front of an orchestra because, first of all, it's not their training. Second of all, it just may not be their talent. It might not be where their strengths lie. And I think that's really a major, major issue. But there's another issue with the way choral conductors approach orchestral players and orchestral conducting that I think is worth talking about. And it's been known for quite a long time, and it involves, believe it or not, the vibrato issue. Not because it concerns vibrato as whether you use it or don't use it per se. It's a point that we can generalize to music much more. Let's put it that way. We can generalize it to music in all of the aspects in which it affects orchestral performance or instrumental performance. And it was discussed by a marvelous musical journalist, Carl Friedrich Kramer, in his Kramer's Music magazine. In 1783, he entered into a controversy with an English guy named Bremner, who was criticizing Geminiani's treatise on violin playing, which said that you should use vibrato as often as possible. And Bremner was bitching and moaning over the fact that orchestral musicians, string players, were using vibrato constantly, and he felt that was disrupting the purity of intonation. Now, the fact that they were using vibrato constantly means, of course, that all of the period instrument people have no idea what they're talking about and have their heads up their ass when they tell you that you should not use vibrato because Bremner said you shouldn't use vibrato, or some people, who cares what he said? It's what they were doing, and they were doing it for the reasons Geminiani said, because it improves the tone, because it makes it more expressive. We all know this, right? But anyway, Kramer translated the entire article into German and then footnoted it and commented on the parts with which he disagreed. And he made the following point, which I want to read to you in extenso because it's a very, very interesting point musicologically. And like I said, it was a debate way back in 1783. The idea of how to make music expressive and what's the difference between vocal and instrumental music, it goes way, way back to the dawn of humanity. And it's one of those discussions that, different sides have gained the upper hand at different periods, but it's an ongoing situation. And here is one take on it. He writes about Bremner: the author of these remarks, it seems to me, and this translation is courtesy of my very, very dear friend, Dr. Sören Meyer-Eller in Munchkin, who really was very, very helpful in finding this stuff and working with me on it. Okay, so he writes, Kramer: the author of these remarks, it seems to me, is opposed to the vibrato, which he calls Bebung, too much. At least the example of a singer that he uses is not correct. Of course, a trembling and unsteady voice is of the primary mistakes, but duo cum faciunt idem non faciunt idem, which means those who do the same are not doing the same. The beginner in singing who cannot sustain a tone, but always wavers at the boundaries of the upper and lower nearest tones, and the experienced singer who uses this with discretion at the right place, are worlds apart. There are not infrequent moments of passion in arias and recitatives in which, if the declamation and evocation of the appropriate expression of each affect, that is, each emotion, is essential to the singing, then vibrato becomes a duty for the singer. And on this point, I would have the audacity to say that the singer sang badly and would have especially failed in terms of relative truth and beauty if he did not use vibrato. Also, the schools of singing advise expressly on this point. The vibrato, Bebung, says Herr Hiller, for example, unquote, means that you do not permit a long sustained tone to be wholly level, but rather let it waver and float somewhat without it becoming higher or lower. The easiest way to achieve this on string instruments is through a back and forth wavering of the finger that is on the string. For the singer, if he wants to produce this with the throat alone, it is more difficult. Some make it easy for themselves by moving the lower jaw. Carestini, famous, what you call them, those people missing their parts, castrato, did this often and always with a very good result, unquote. Now, Kramer goes on. To apply these observations to instrumental performance is easy. Thus, if vocal performance and the expression of passionate emotion are the models and ideal for the instrument to the extent that the indefinite wordless tone permits, then it goes without saying that the instrumentalist, in places where the voice would use vibrato, not only may use it, but must. But that this, with all refinements and ornaments, should not be used too frequently, but rather with discretion and thoughtfulness, I have no desire to dispute with our author. Everyone who has heard C.P.E. Bach playing the clavichord must have noticed those infinite nuances of light and shade, that expressiveness through his tenuto, which is basically nothing else than the vibrato, spread throughout his playing. Okay, now, I'm not just talking here, as I said, about vibrato. This applies to instrumental music more generally. The basic lesson that we learn here is that instrumental music, because it does not have words, because it does not give us the benefit of coming out and saying, this is what it means, has to be exaggerated. It has to be exaggerated in certain ways that make the expressive intent of the composer particularly clear in terms of the technique of each and every instrument. And I personally believe that it requires that element of trust between the conductor and the orchestra that so many choral conductors just don't have. They still think they're conducting a choir, or they act as though they are. Remember what Charles Mackerras said recently? I also quoted him. I was reading a little bit of one of his interviews where he said conductors today, conducting an orchestra, he said, is easy. Go conduct an opera, that's difficult. Conducting an orchestra isn't hard because you trust your players to know how to play their instruments. And your job as the conductor is to make sure that whatever the expressive point is of the music is, that it's realized in terms of what those instruments can do. You're not a John Eliot Gardner who micromanages his way to death and tries to control every aspect of performance the way you can control a choir. Because remember, most choral music is in 4 or 5 parts. So what are you controlling? You're controlling 5 things, maximally most of the time. You're controlling once you get the blend, once you get the articulation and the diction correct, you've got 5 basic parts. But in an orchestra, you have different parts that are unequal, naturally unequal, some of which are going to be louder than others, some of which should be prominent, and this is changing constantly, and the way that the instruments play is changing constantly. There is no way a conductor who is used to the kind of control that he exercises over a choir is going to be successful at attempting to do the same thing over an orchestra. And so, what often happens with choral conductors? Well, with Robert Shaw, they were just boring. With some of these period instrument guys like Gardner, they just play fast. They play everything fast. The period instrument people do everything fast. And it's very interesting that they should play everything so quickly, because most of the evidence we have from the period suggests that the tempos that they adopt, even if they can claim Beethoven wrote a metronome marker, forget all that those tempos are in reality much, much quicker than would have been playable in the day or would have been desirable. Why? Because you, as the listener, need time. You need time to take in the expressive point of a melodic line. And it would take more time than if there were words, not less, because the lack of words means that the emphasis has to be greater. And one of the greatest and easiest ways to make an impression, an emotional and expressive impression, is to give you, the listener, time to hear it, because the emotional expression of the instrument is given to you more slowly than it is when these orchestras are just blistering through an allegro or blasting through a slow movement and playing completely inexpressively as without vibrato in addition. But this, to me, the difference between voices and instruments, the inherent differences between the two, and the inherent necessities that vary in terms of expression are one of the many reasons, I assume, that so many choral conductors make such boring, absolutely boring orchestral conductors. I think that they are two different beasties, and just because you're good at one, it doesn't mean that you're going to be good at the other. And it's a particular mistake when the period instrument people, I think, get in front of a modern orchestra in the romantic repertoire, and all they have in terms of interpretation is a set of rules. Play without vibrato, play your rhythms like this, do this articulation like that. And they think that if you feed these people these rules and tell them to do it accordingly, and everyone has to do the same thing, that the result is going to be somehow idiomatic or expressively compelling. You can do that with a chorus. You can tell everyone to articulate the same thing because they're saying the same words. But when you have no words, it's a whole different world, and it really depends on learning to trust your players, to know what they're doing with their instruments. That's my theory, or at least part of the theory. It's a very complicated and complex subject, but I wanted to throw out some ideas for you to think about and for you to see if you agree or disagree, or if you find some other nuances that I may have missed. I don't want to keep talking forever. We've already gone on for 21 minutes, which I think is plenty of time on this topic, and I now turn it over to you to give me your own perspective on this, also from your own experience as an instrumentalist, as a conductor, as a chorister. I've done all of those things, even a little bit of really bad conducting. I can't even tell you, like the offstage orchestra and Mahler 2, and a couple bits of Sibelius here and there when the actual conductor wanted to go to the back of the hall and hear what everyone else was doing, and he stuck me up there and said, "Conduct it." So I have a little feel for that, but only in the most amateurish way. I know that there are several of you out there who have actual real experience as a conductor. And so you can tell me if I have my head up my ass or if maybe I'm onto something. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.